pasamos a la segunda charla del día, que es en inglés. Y voy a presentar a la ponente. The lecturer is Judith Ryser. We've met now, 12 years ago. We had the European Urbanism Summer School here in CEU San Pablo, in this same school. And so we spent a very nice long week with students from all over Europe, and we had the honor of having Judith with us. So I have the privilege to introduce her, but she's asked me to be brief. So I'll just make it short. Judith is an architect and urbanist. She's a MSc in social sciences. She's dedicated her very intense very international activity with a focus of the built environment and sustainability and its contribution to the knowledge society. She's all her private practice, public sector, academic and research is very, very wide, and she belongs and is a main contributor and leader in many international networks in the sectors of the city and the development and sustainability. Just to name a few, she's a director at the Cityscope Europe Consultancy, a special advisor at Fundación Metrópoli. She's a senior researcher and lecturer at University College London, where she's also a member of the development planning units, a very prestigious planning institution within the University College London. She runs the blog Urban Thinker on the issues of open cities, police and politics, and urban art and culture. She's life member of ISOCARP, which is the International Society of City and Regional Planners, where she has been vice president, and she's head of the UK delegation, senior advisor and co-editor at Silk Cities, an International Society of City and Regional Planners. And I could go on, but I think we thank you very much, Judith, for coming all the way from London, and it is a pleasure and a privilege to have you here. So, thank you.
I lived in Madrid for 20 years ago. It was very exciting at that time, but it's a long time ago, so my Spanish is a little rusty. So I will try to speak in English and not too fast. And also I have images, so I hope this is helping. And I really find that the first speakers to follow is a real challenging act for me, but I feel that we have a similar fundamental approach to show how architecture, the built environment relates to politics, and that's what I want to show as well here. I'm not a specialist on workers' housing, I'm not a historian, so it is very much my personal selection of facts which I have put here together. I have quite a bit of slides with details, so I will go over those quickly because I will leave all the material here, so to read up and to probably will put in the details in a book. So I would just want to give the gist of my argument here, if that's okay with you. So next one. So this is the kind of overview of what I'm talking about, the periods, the policies, the housing typology, the housing provision, those who made it, and the workers' welfare. That's basically the aspects I want to cover. So I take a long view and start with because the UK was the first country to industrialize. So it also had all the negative sides of industrialization, i.e. slums, i.e. Deprivation, stuff like that. And so you had a lot of social critics in those days, as you can see, very famous Hogarth sketches, and kind of, the Victorian slum life was really quite horrendous, but that is industrialization. So, but there were utopians, and it started in very much in France with Saint-Simon, and you had all these ideal cities which they designed, which were basically very progressive in a way, because it was around work, living, and everything in one place, sometimes even in one building. So this is just a historic background. Now, in the UK, you had different protagonists as well for that sort of more integrated, more humane way of providing housing for workers. And so you had the utopians who built the model villages, I will show them. And then you had the philanthropists, which what they said is the housing the poor rather than just the workers. And then the Ebenezer Howers with his garden cities, which very much an outcome of all these developments. I just remind you of Engels and the housing question, because he was an industrialist, and he had a factory in Manchester, but he was very critical about the workers' conditions at that time. Now, Robert Owen was one of the most important thinker, utopian socialist, and he proposed communities, so precisely that basic modern village, and workers' communities. And what he wanted to do is to have a humane treatment of industrial workers. That was his objective. And so he built model villages. And he was really a pioneer, not only for reforming the workplace, the factories, but also to create cooperative services for the workers and to educate the workers. That he really was introducing. So his village was New Lanark. So he built it in Scotland. What happened is basically the factories who were in the big cities, which were very polluted and so on. So these industrials moved the factories at the edge of the city, or in the countryside, and they built the village with everything for the workers' housing as well as the services. And that is where they created the cooperative movement and educating the workers. So this is the example of New Lanark. As you can see, this is the plan. It was quite compact, and it was built in the traditional materials in Scotland, in stone. These buildings are 150 years old. They're there. They're renovated, they're inhabited, and so forth. So this was very solid kind of construction, very long-term view. And this was the services here. How can I show? Yeah. On the bottom right, a typical community hall and so on. So they had all sorts of social infrastructure in these villages. So the next one was similar. So these were some kind of enlightened industrialists who obviously realized that if they give a better life chance to their workers, they will have also a better production. So this is Saltaire, a model village, which is in Yorkshire, near Bradford. Again, he took out his textile mill with the workers and built this village. So, and all these sites are actually either UNESCO listed or asked for being listed. So this is Saltford village. You can see the original plan with always these collective buildings, with a town hall, with a church. Usually church was very important. Religion was very important. They were most of them were actually Quakers. So religion was motivating them to be more humane and so forth. And this is the type of housing which still exists, which obviously was renovated and so forth. But the structure is as it was. And these villages, of course, are no longer factories. They are now gentrified, but they're inhabited, and people love to be there. And so that one is Bourneville. That's the chocolate factory of the Cadburys, still exists. And this is the only one where they have kept activities in this village. And they continue, they do the research, some of the research for that chocolate factory, which still exists in the UK. Today, so that's the one which is still there. So here is the actual original plan. This is an original perspective at the time. You can see the factories and the housing around it. And then these are the housing typologies which they have built. So they were quite low-rise, quite dense, but quite low-rise, two up, two down, and so forth, semi-detached or sometimes terraces. So they were actually, this was real villages. Now the last one is the Port Sunlight. So that was Lever. They still are very, very big multinational manufacturing of soap powder and stuff like that. And again, they built the village, but the objective there was to share prosperity. They said, okay, the workers should have a part of the wealth which is created by production. So that was very innovative, actually, in a way. So they had an amazingly humane and sharing perspective. So this is the village. You can see the original plan. Again, with the center, you have shown something very similar, where you did have the church and the pub and the town hall and things like that, the community center and the housing around. Quite dense, quite in nature, basically. And so this is the drawing is from the time. So that's the kind of, and the style was obviously of the time, either arts and crafts or sort of neo-Tudor and so forth. So they were very similar to what the buildings were in general, because of course the workers' housing was a small part of the basic of urbanization process, which happened in the UK in general. And so these are typical kind of designs, houses which exist today. Now, what is interesting in the UK is basically in the 19th century, these enlightened philanthropists, they built housing for workers. But that then changed in the 20th century for housing for the working classes or housing the poor. That was a second strand which philanthropists also provided. And so that was what they were saying, homes for the artisan and laboring poor. That was the philanthropist. Then Howard invented the Garden City, which was very much coming from this movement, and which was what he wanted, is to create cities for ideal mixed communities. So it was really the rich and the poor together, so they had this kind of social idea of this basic being integrated. And then the local authorities, the early laws actually allowed them and then obliged them to build social housing rather than workers' housing, social or public housing. So the public sector was producing and renting and managing and running housing for the workers and for the lower income classes. Then there was also Booth, actually, which was a very important influence, because he did a map of London, very detailed, every house to house, and he looked at what the kind of society was living there, related to income classes. It's super interesting. It's just been republished, by the way. It's a big tom like that. Super interesting, because they really have a record of how the society was at that time, around the turn of the century. As you can see, it was published in 1899. And so before the First World War, you had the philanthropists who really were building the housing, not just the industrialists themselves, but just philanthropists like Peabody, Rowntree, Guinness. They had big businesses, manufacturing, so on, but they were not building for their own labor. They were building housing for the homes for the artisan and laboring poor of London, for example. That was Peabody. Or Joseph Rowntree was workers and low-income people in Earthwick Model Village. So they did similar things. Then there were often women who took initiatives and actually provided housing for rent for the poorer people, like Octavia Hill, like Henrietta Barnett, and Toynbee. Then he also created a place where the workers not only could live, but where they could acquire skills. So there was really a social movement in those days, before the First World War. And these are the type of housing which the philanthropists built. So the bottom line are the Peabody ones. They were quite dense, they were quite high, and in cities, but they had always a public space. They had greenery. They had 4 stories and always walk up, so no lifts. So you kept fit in those. And the other ones on the top are more in the suburbs. But for example, the third on the right is in Manchester. So these houses were also then built not just in the model villages, but in cities in London, in the UK. So these were the local authorities. The London County Council was obviously one of the first authorities which built a lot of housing for the workers and for the poorer income people. And these in orange are the estates, which I'm showing pictures. And this, what's important is the 1980 Housing and Town Planning Act, because that gave the power to the local authorities to actually build housing and to have access to capital to build the houses and to maintain them and to rent them at a low rent. And these are the type of estates. On the left, you have the Boundary Estate, which was the very first one, which Peabody built. As you can see, it's still there today. The bottom one is today. So very solidly built and very people like to live there, actually. Of course, the spaces were quite small, but and the families were big, as you showed as well. I mean, not maybe 20 children, but 4 or 5, So they were, it was quite dense. But it was like you, I mean, I haven't shown it here, but they had the proper, I mean, they have a kitchen with a bath underneath the sink, so they had one bath per week and so on. But it was modernizing. It was giving actually equipment. And the Millbank estate is still there today. As you can see, the bottom picture is I took last month. So this is, or last summer. It is there. It is, of course, inhabited, renovated. Sometimes because the flats were small, people then bought 2 and put them together and so on. But it is a very, very liked place and in central London. So these locations were usually very good as well. And this is what we all know about that, so I will skip this, but that was Ebenezer Howard's idea about the ideal garden city, and he was involved in 3 of them. So the first one ever built, which the architect was Raymond Unwin and Barry Parker, and they were quite famous architects at the time. So you can see the plan, which again was very similar to what you showed. It was the housing and the centre with a church and with a pub and with a town hall and so on. So this is what exists today, housing kept as they are, and of course it's listed and it's very gentrified. Then you have the Hampstead Garden suburb. Again, that was the women were behind that one, Octavia Hill and these other philanthropists, and they even lived there themselves for a while. And again, you can see it's a very similar type of typology, quite dense, 2-3-story houses. Of the architectural style of the time. And they can see the church. It was always an important building in those places. And then Welwyn Garden City, which was built in 1920 and again designed by Ebenezer Howard himself. So this is the plan which he produced, and this is how it looks today. And the idea was to have really nature in the city. So it was very, very green from the very start. And that was kept even over time. It changed hands and so forth. It's become a local authority. But it is really, the spirit is still there. So it's quite interesting. And the British people, this is their dream. The noble savage idea. So you live in good housing, but next to the airport and but not without the noise, So then what happened after the First World War was the creation of the welfare state. So that was very important because, I mean, the war was very brutal and a lot of people died. I mean, it was absolutely terrible and there was a lot of destruction and so on. So they said, we want to have a new society. We want to do better. And so there was a political consensus. And of course, as usual, after the war, it was the left who came into power, but then the right took over. But they didn't change the politics. They in principle, they wanted to rebuild the cities and for everyone. So that was a very much a harmonious type of approach. But you have to also not forget that this is the public sector mentality and ideology. But the private sector was actually which provided the majority of the housing for the workers, the poor and so on. And that housing was very often substandard and slums. So one has to not forget that. This always happened in parallel. So this is the type of ideal houses. On the right, you can see the 2 typologies for houses for the people, the low-rise ones with thatched roofs and so forth, and then the blocks blocks, and the blocks were then built by Peabody and Roundtree and those kind of philanthropists, where people lived with rather cheap rents. This is the type of council housing which was built, and very often, because there was such a huge demand for this housing, so there was big quantities, as you also mentioned in your talk. So the architects of the day, they obviously were very keen to build these houses and design them. Sometimes it's competition, sometimes nominated. So that the right-hand side is a block. There still exists today in central London, designed by Edwin Lutyens, who was a very famous architect of the time. And on the left-hand side, you see the very typical type of council housing: brick buildings, brick load-bearing walls, and so forth, 4 stories usually, and so forth, with some balconies, access balconies, and so on. I mean, very livable, basically. So then came the Second World War. Destruction again. I mean, London was bombed and blitzed and so on, and other cities as well. So you had to start again. Again, there was a consolidation of the welfare state. That's where they created the National Health Service, the free education, and all those kind of things. And there was political consensus still again after the Second World War. But what was important is that planning acquired an important role. So it wasn't just doing small things here and there, but actually to have an idea of how to conceive the whole city. So the context was the Greater London Plan by Abercrombie, which he actually produced during the war. Let's not forget, they were really optimistic that after the war they will have a new life. And he, at that time, the actual council was the London County Council, which was quite small, but the city had already grown around that, and he did a plan for the whole conurbation. That was very new, actually, and so then the LCC became the Greater London Council, but only in '65, and there were 2 important acts, political acts. One was the Town and Country Planning Act, which included planning in design and the building and development control and all that sort of thing. And this act is still basically the basis of planning today, although now the Tories would like to get rid of it altogether, but they have not managed yet. And the new Town Act was also due to Abercrombie, because what they were thinking, London was very congested before the war, but of course it was destroyed a lot. So, but they had planned to build new towns around London, 8 new towns, so that the workers, together with the workplaces, I mean, it was very much functionalism, Corbusian style and so on, that they would have these new settlements around London, which would be self-contained, so that people wouldn't commute. They would actually live in these places like Stevenage and Croydon and so forth. So that was the design. And here is just an extract of the Abercrombie plan. So he was also on the right hand, so you can see that he thought about the social structure of the city, and very much inspired by the Booth maps and so forth. Say, well, we have to keep a social mix. We have to design the city on neighborhood units so that they are basically harmonious and they have the services they need and so forth. Today, what are we doing? 15-minute city. That's what they tried to do at that time. It's really interesting. They called it differently, but it was that. And on the left, you can see that actually how big the conurbation actually was. The dark bit is the boundary, the administrative boundary of the Greater London Council, but London was already spreading and having a lot of, I mean, it was a whole region, the city region of the southeast. Now, after the post-war, so what it really became was not so much workers' housing, but working class housing, and that included the low-income service people as well, because as the UK was the first industrialized, so production basically diminished, and the economy became a service economy very soon after that. So it was for those type of workers, and very much immediately after the war in 1945, they built prefabs, so that people could actually go back to the city and live there and work there. So on the right-hand side, you have some images of these prefabs, which people absolutely loved. And some of them still exist. I mean, so imagine, just on one level, with outside space and so on. So of course, they were built very quickly, prefab, I mean, in a factory, so that people could be housed. So that was what Churchill did when he was still Prime Minister. And then came the Labour government, and they then did reconstruction and slum clearance, because not only were the cities, the big cities, destroyed in big parts, but there were still a lot of slums left. And they said, we have to get rid of that, because you cannot have this type of lifestyle for people. It's not human, and so on. So they really had it. They did it in a big way. So, but then the Conservatives came into power in 1951, but they did not actually change the basic idea that yes, you had to actually improve the whole city and the way of life and the accommodation in particular. And these in orange again are the estates, which I show you, and you have the social housing. But the workers' housing then became broader. It was actually social housing. So under the Labour government, they continued the slum clearance, demolition, reconstruction, and very large housing estates, again, which were designed most of the time either by good architects who were actually employed by the local authorities, because they had a big architects and planning department in those days, or else by private architects who were asked in to design those big estates, sometimes for thousands of people. Then came the Conservative government under Heath, and like you showed as well, suddenly they put tower blocks in. Why? Because they didn't manage on the land. The land became very expensive, so they didn't manage to put the density they needed in order to make the equation work with the income from the low rents. So they put low-rise, dense for families, and tower blocks to make up for that with the single people, and so forth. And these are what I will show you later. That became the problem areas as well. So not surprisingly, but not because of design, but because of this social structure, of course, and segregation. And then came the Labour government. So they did urban renewal, urban regeneration. They stopped pulling everything down, because people really objected to that. They say, look, I mean, not all is bad. We can actually regenerate it. We can and also we want to keep some of our history and so forth. So that was a little change in relation to design and in relation to the actual physical fabric, which was quite interesting. But the social housing was often designed by the best architects, as you can see, because that was really good work for them. And also then the public housing had space standards. And that was also very innovative. So the government actually put forward to say we have minimum spaces, which was a Parker Morris space standard, which very quickly became maximum, unfortunately. But they are better. And they were quite integrated, so that the layout of the flats were clever, so that people could change things around if they needed, when the family changed and grew and diminished and so on. But the private sector didn't have to. It was compulsory for the public sector, but not the private sector. So the private sector housing was always below that standard. So that one has also to keep in mind. So actually the publicly housed rental housing, which was social housing, was actually quite good. But you could see the big estates looked very different from the rest of the private sector. So there was some kind of stigma to be on those places. But internally, they had actually quite good lives, because they also had services there in those days. So the providers of housing were the local authority, as I showed, then the philanthropists. So the Peabodys continued. But what they did basically, Peabody, they rebuilt where the places were destroyed from the war, or they repaired the damaged estates. So they had kind of complementary work. And you can see they were all subsidized, but the local authorities' subsidies went to brick and mortar, to the actual building, whilst the philanthropists, they got the subsidy for the rents. So the philanthropists built in a private, capitalistic way, but the rents were subsidized. So that's how the equation added up. Then there were the charities, which like shelter. So they again subsidized to the person, which is also important because they were also contributing to that. So these are the type of architecture, which was of course inspired by modernism, by Corbusier, by just like as you showed. So on the left-hand side, you can see the local authorities. The top one is the first tower block, which has been built, which is still there, which is renovated, which is of course now sold. The flats are sold and so on. So and the bottom one is the middle one is a typical large estate with the tower blocks to make up for. I mean with with bars and blocks, very much like Corbusier's ideas of unité d'habitation and so forth. So it was very much like that. And the bottom one is when they, in the suburbs, more on the outskirts, where it was still low-rise, basically, but terraced. And then in the 60s, then the brutalism came into fashion, so they built, of course, the public housing was then more and more similar to the private housing. All this is public housing. The middle one is a very famous one, which is a huge, and also their sites were usually in a difficult place, along railways or along motorways, and so they had to, turn inwards and so on. So it was quite ingenious design. And the bottom, you can see that you have the single tower blocks, but the low-rise beside. In the 70s, they went away from this, as I showed before, from the tower blocks and the very, very low-rise. So they built these kind of medium-rise size ones, and that was all designed by private architects, actually, in the 70s, and still exists. The philanthropists, they design, as you can see, they're quite similar type of things. So on the left-hand side, you have the Peabody, what they built. You can see the top left-hand is the entrance to this big estate, and the one in the middle is how it looked inside. So they had big courtyard. So it was bright, it had light. I mean, it was actually very, from a health point of view, they were very good buildings, well designed. And then the housing associations came in, which were builders, but who were specifically subsidized to build for low-income people. And so then came what I personally see as the complete break. Thatcher came into power. She said, hello, this is not good. We need private sector, we all do it all, and so forth. And anyway, so she introduced in 1980 the right to buy, and that means that the people who lived in these social houses and so on, who rented but who could stay there forever, including changing generations and so on, so they had security of tenure and everything, so they had the right to buy that. Of course, they didn't necessarily all have the money, and those who did, so they bought it, and the next day they sold it to private sector speculators and moved somewhere out into the slums or wherever. I mean, I'm giving a black and white picture, but it was very much like that. I mean, I lived in London during that time, so I experienced what was going on, and in other cities the same. So it was really, because the equation didn't add up anymore. Because before, the local authorities, the public sector, had a housing stock. And on that stock, it could borrow money to build new houses and do the maintenance. So that was quite a balanced way of doing it. But once they had to sell off, usually the best parts, of course, on top of the tower blocks or the low-rise ones with gardens and so on. So the best part of the social housing was sold off and immediately gated off and so forth and so on. So they had the residue, which were more difficult to maintain, which were built in concrete prefab and so on, so which had a lot of technical problems. So it became really difficult. And the public housing then also had problems, physical problems and so on. I mean, the maintenance was not always good, all that sort of thing. But in my view, it's due to that. So then she abolished the Greater London Council as well. So you didn't have a citywide authority, planning authority anymore. We had nobody, empty. It was a big fight. It was really very awful. But anyway, so she managed that. And that, of course, also contributed to all this free-for-all, privatization, whatever you like, individual responsibility. Why should the state, a small state, why should we do anything for you? You just either you swim or you perish. So that was the kind of approach of that Thatcher government, I'm afraid. Then came the Labour government. So they put back a London-wide planning authority, a bit different, and also with an actually directly elected mayor. We still have that. And that, of course, was a good thing for London, because, and in other cities as well, they started to have mayors for the whole city. In Manchester, for example, it's for the whole city conurbation. So it's several local authorities which have one mayor in common. And so that was actually a very different approach again to including social housing, of course. But then came the Tory government, which we have at the moment. As you can see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 prime ministers in 4 years. I mean, you know, you have to do that. So back to square one, I'm afraid. This is my position, as you can imagine. But anyway, so I want just to show what happened in this, what I think were the critical aspects of this right to buy break with a political consensus. That the social housing units were sold to tenants at a large discount. So, i.e., on the basis of the taxpayers, all of us subsidized these sales. And then, of course, they speculated. They basically didn't live there anymore. They sold on and went somewhere else. And then the social housing became affordable housing. It was no longer. Affordable housing means 80% of the market rental value. So it was absolutely out of reach, is out of reach for most of the working people at the moment. So this was a real problem. So you had overcrowding, you had, I mean, all these kind of, you know, all these ills. And then the housing associations were given, I mean, the councils were forced to give their estates to the housing association, to the private sector. So again, the standards were going down and so forth. So they forced the council estates or either to sell it to them or to give it them to private developers. Sometimes they would just pull down the whole lot, put 10 times the volume onto the site, usually very valuable sites in city centers or near city centers. So that was pure neoliberal approach to the built environment. And the Peabody was also interesting because then Peabody was one of the biggest philanthropist builder, but they then gave they were also important to even work for those who got the, sometimes even they got the housing estates from the public sector, and they renovated them and they are now renting them out and so forth. So the Peabody. But what they did is also interesting, the last one, the bed set, and I will show you a picture. They were used by private developers, or private architects, for eco-design housing, so it became more fashionable and more important. And so the Peabody was sometimes the contractor as well, so that was an interesting development. So it's they're very big. So you can see here the typology. You have the huge estates, which were the ones where they pulled everything down, rebuilt everything, and this is Thamesmead, which is like a city in the city. It's in the east of London, on the Thames, on the floodplain, by the way, and that was how it was designed originally. The top middle is the original building, but then you can see on the right. They started to, when it was privatized, they started to put tower blocks and so forth. I mean, it's very dense and has a lot of social problems in these tower blocks, as we all know. The bottom one is the typical, the Peabody, which is the bed set, which was designed by Bill Dunster, which was a very ecological development with every ecological technology you can have. I mean, you know, with lighting and air conditioning, with pellet fired district heating and all that sort of stuff. It's a very interesting estate, still there, but of course it was a private development, but with Peabody doing it. Now, here is just a little illustration of the kind of problems which we had with, especially in this social housing, the tower block. That was a system-built one. I mean, it was famous when it collapsed. So it was really very, very dangerous. People died, and it was an awful kind of thing. Then people started to be afraid of tower blocks. They didn't want to live in them anymore. But they had no choice because that was there or nothing. And the middle one, as you may have heard, also is recent when the Grenfell Tower caught fire, because they renovated the facades and they took combustible paneling for the facade, and that just went through the tower, I mean, in no time. And a lot of people died, I think 70-something, and it was really awful. Recent. So this is still standing there, absolutely. People are not rehoused and so on. It's a real problem. Then what happened, as I mentioned before, when they didn't manage to maintain the stock because they didn't have the finance, the income, so you had a lot of things like that, damp and so on. So actually, the living conditions in some of those flats results were really not good. And on the right hand side, you could see it was complete dereliction as well, and people then just abandoned the place, and you had a concentration of problem families moving in there when they were evicted from there because they couldn't pay the rent. So they were just, then you don't care with them, and that's, so there is a lot of that as well around. And this is just, I don't want to go into detail, but I did sort of, because it's talking to architects, so I did a little typology of who provided the houses, as I showed you, and the type of design which they used, as you could see from the pictures. So, and what the way they approached it. So this is just a summary of what I have showed you before. And here I just wanted to give you some idea of the relationship between the workers' housing, the public housing, so and the other type. So you can see the red line is the local authority housing, and how the 1980s with Thatcher, you can see how it went down. Absolutely, it's down there, local authority. Then the housing associations took over a bit, but they never really came off the ground properly. And the rest is the private enterprise. So this is the actual situation, 49 to 2013. And this you can see as well, the tenure. What the Brits want is owner occupation. So this is the majority of the housing in the UK. Then you have the social rent, which is the public housing, which goes down. And then you have the private rent, which is the housing association and so on, which is on the bottom, but which is sort of overtaking a little bit. But you can see this is the aspiration, basically. It's not, people don't want that if they can get the owner occupation. And so this is my conceptual framework for the future. So here are the periods of the right to buy, the forced sales and so on. Then you had the financial crash, and you had really erosion of affordable houses because it was impossible for them to pay the rent, so they were evicted and so on. Then you have the austerity period, so that was laissez-faire, so who could, the others, who cares? And then you had COVID, of course, and so no building, no nothing. And now we have a revival of public affordable housing or not, we don't know. I mean, this is the big question. And here is who provided the housing. And so this just to recapitulate, so that the housing situation today, you could see that it was sold off in 1980, so that was the big break. And then the public social housing also was pushed out of the center because of that. Because the best places were, of course, in what the private sector wanted was the land, because the land value was very high in city centers. So they pushed people more and more out from their communities, out from their work opportunities. Very often it was casual work and so on. So that created social problems, of course. And then you had the model villages, which I showed at the beginning. They are very small now, well maintained, completely gentrified. So they're not tourist attractions, basically. So you go and you can visit them with a coach and so on. They will show around and so forth. And the council tenants were exactly evicted or displaced when they couldn't pay, or when the private sector wanted to demolish and rebuild. And so there is the social segregation has increased enormously, especially in cities. And of course that meant there is a lack of affordable housing for key workers, i.e. the teachers, the cleaners, the people who work in hospitals and the people who work in hotels and so on. So we have a real housing problem. It's not about quantity, because the private sector is building speculative housing, which they sell from plan to China and so forth, so they're empty. You can go to city centers and the city is dark at night, because it's just pure investment, speculative. They have never seen them, they build them, they buy them. The capital appreciation is some 10% per annum, so why bother to rent them? So this is, I give a picture which is quite black and white, but this is very true. I mean, there is evidence for that. So the social housing needs continue to, they exceed affordable housing supply, or anything else for that matter. And what is today? So the neoliberals are in power, as you know, and so there is self-reliance and cost of living, but we have a cost of living crisis. So there is a tension, obviously, between those two, and as you can see from our frictions politically and so on, I mean, it's real. So you have eviction and displacement, you have overcrowding. Do people go either live on the streets or live with their neighbors or with their family or something? And then you have a lot of, because the local authority is still, in theory, obliged to rehouse these people, but they haven't got any spaces, so they are in temporary accommodation somewhere in old, like these rundown buildings I showed and so on. So they live, and homelessness, which is very much increasing at the moment. I mean, you go where I live in central London, people sleep in the street, lots of them, really lots of them. I mean, in the sixth richest country of the world, you know, it is quite a scandal in my view. And so what about tomorrow, ideally? So what you really would like is to have inner city regeneration rather than just pull everything down and so forth. But you would need to have some kind of political system which actually gives the infrastructure for that so that you could, that economically it would make sense and so on. Then also to densify the suburbs, because they're very, very low density and very widespread, almost like in America, in the UK as well. And of course they resist that. They don't want any of the poor in their area and so on. And then you have the small town extensions, that happen a bit, especially I explained the new towns around London, for example. So they are growing a little bit, and actually that works quite well because people find work locally and so forth. But it's a small amount in relation to the total demand. And then the 15 minutes neighborhoods, as I said, well, they actually existed. So we are reinventing them in the public housing. So you want to have the mixed-use cities with genuinely affordable housing for all. That would be my ideal future. So thank you very much for your attention.